Welcome to the Making Waves at Sea Level podcast with your host, Tom Singer. In each episode, we will explore the interesting stories of business executives, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders who are shaking things up and growing their companies. It is time to make some waves. Now here's your host, Tom Singer.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Making Waves at Sea Level. Thank you so much for tuning into this show. I know some people listen twice a week, which makes me so happy. But even if this is your first show, I'm glad that you're here. I started this podcast 6 years ago. It was originally called Cool Things Entrepreneurs Do, and it was really sort of my way to have access to smart people who were doing really cool things in business. It was like my personal university. And along the way, we developed an audience and people listen. And I really like the fact that this show has been shared with over 1 million people, and it's going to continue. We're now over 6 years and over 600 episodes. This year, we made a little bit of a branding change and became Making Waves at Sea Level, but we still like to talk to really smart people who are doing cool things. Now, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, you know that I host a couple of other podcasts. I host a show that I host a couple shows now for associations where I'm their paid host who kind of helps them run their shows. And then I also host a program called The Webinar Talk Show. And my friend Eliz Green and I, who's been a guest here on this show several times, she and I decided early on in COVID, when everybody and their brother started hosting webinars and virtual conferences, we decided that a lot of those events sucked and that they weren't really doing the best they could to communicate. And we realized that something was missing, and that was the interview process. I mean, if you think about television, nobody turns on their TV at 8 o'clock at night to watch a lecture. They don't want to watch someone scrolling through PowerPoint slides. However, since the 1950s, people have turned on their television at all hours of the day to watch talk shows and variety shows. And we decided that's what this online learning, that's what it needed. So we founded the Webinar Talk Show, and we've now done, I think it's like 70 episodes where we've interviewed people, a little bit of a focus on the meetings industry about why you should not cancel your event. But the reality is that this format is something that all associations and companies should be looking at if they want to engage their audience more through communication. So I wanted to invite Eliz on Making Waves at Sea Level today so that we could talk a little bit about this whole idea of why interviews work. So before we get started, Eliz, welcome back to Making Waves at Sea Level.
I am so happy to be here.
So, Eliz, I have a couple sponsors of this show, and so I have to thank the first sponsor before we can dive into this, and that sponsor is Spectrum Reach. You know, at Spectrum Reach, they know three things better than anyone. They know how to harness the power of multi-screen advertising. They know how to offer a simplified one-stop shop destination for marketing solutions. And they know how our cities and towns tick because they're our neighbors. They are the most trusted media partner in America, and I'm proud that they sponsor Making Waves at Sea Level. Go check them out at spectrumreach.com. So, Eliz, let's talk about the Webinar Talk Show. Let's talk about the way we started it. What are your memories of this back in March and early April?
My memory is that it was a particularly stressful time for the both of us as we watched what we had on our calendars disappear. And knowing that our industry was changing and we actually had expertise that other people needed, but we didn't really have any proof of what we could do, particularly in a fully virtual setting. You and I have sat next to each other and been the MCs for hybrid events in the past.
So we actually started 6 years ago with something we called, and we still have, called the Conference Talk Show, which was for hybrid events. And the idea was your at-home audience doesn't want you just to live stream your main stage and put up a little slide that says back in a half hour when you go to coffee breaks. We realized 6 years ago that at-home audience of a hybrid event, they needed more. And so we used to fill those gaps with interviews. Mm-hmm. But you're right, we didn't really have that social proof because we weren't thinking the whole world would go virtual.
Correct. The other thing, going back to those 6 years of experience, is we know that successful events have active participants, not passive viewers. and honestly, doesn't matter what format you have that event. If it's in person, hybrid, or virtual, you actually want active participants. And that's one of the things that works so well in an interview format, the way that we do it.
Well, and that's the thing is back in March, then every association, every company pivoted to whatever they could to go virtual. And I started participating, logging on. A lot of our friends invited us to webinars. And the problem was it was just a talking head over PowerPoint. And one of those is great, but 4 of them a day really starts to grain on you. And so we decided to take this idea of, getting people engaged, being, more interactive, even if it's the one-way interactive, just through a host interviewing a guest. And we decided to create this platform that we call the Webinar Talk Show.
Well, and I think particularly this is important when you have so many people working remotely, where they're already spending significant time on Zoom or GoToMeeting or Teams or whatever you're on. More of the same. I mean, that's an educational concept. More of the same doesn't necessarily deliver the education that you want or the information that you want. You have to relate to that information in different ways in order for people to really engage with it. And we've done a lot of things since COVID hit in terms of helping organizations really make that shift from what they were planning, perhaps in person, to a fully virtual environment. And it's not just association events or that sort of thing. Companies are really looking at what used to happen at the end of the year. There are wrap-up meetings. We're looking to the sales kickoff for the next event or whatever that is. All of those things used to happen with people in a room together. And now you have to figure out how to do that remotely. And when you're delivering important information, thinking about how you're delivering that in a way that will really pull people in is so very important, because you can make the most sexy slide deck in the entire world, and it doesn't matter.
Well, and then you and I both have a background of serving as master of ceremonies, both together and separate for these types of events in this hybrid world. And I think that people who are having virtual events, having a professional MC is more important in a virtual environment than it even is in a live environment. Now, obviously, I've done a whole bunch of live environment master of ceremonies gigs, and I love it. But I think that if you're holding a meeting and you're just like, well, we're just going to get our board of director chair to be the MC, right, even though he's not a professional communicator, it'll be fine. I think you're setting that event up for some failure. And so we've taken this experience as an MC. And one of the things I know you've done with your clients, I've done with mine, and then we've done with our shared clients, is we've said, don't give that keynoter an hour. Give them 20 or 30 minutes to give their best stuff, and then have them come on with us and we'll interview them. And I like to compare what we do to Kelly and Ryan with their live in the morning syndicated talk show, or like Larry King or Oprah. If you watch people who are really good at interviewing, they get so much more out of the guests than if they just let that person just ramble. Absolutely true. And you actually have a saying that I really love, that there are no scripts when it comes to a conversation. That's right. Conversations have no scripts. And obviously we have an idea of where we're going when we do an interview. But one of the best things about an interview is if the guest says something, you can go, whoa, let's go back to that and let's go deeper. And I think that's what a professional interviewer, which is kind of how I try to position me and you now to clients, is like, who on your staff is a professional interviewer? Because I know you've done hundreds, but I've done over 1,000 interviews between my podcast, between the other podcasts that I host with the Webinar Talk Show. And then I've been interviewing people live on stage for years. And I started running the numbers, and it's like, how many people could you have as your master of ceremonies who has done 1,000 interviews? And I'm trying to get that message out to people that someone who knows how to interview is going to get a much more engaging program than someone who just lets the person talk. Well, let's think about
an executive that needs to deliver some information.
Ooh, this is great. Internal company stuff is some of my favorite things.
Right. So maybe it's, we've had a great year and here's the impact it's going to be on our company. That would be fun. But I think right now, more likely, it is, here are the challenges that we're facing right now. And here are some changes that are coming down the road. You could deliver that in a voiceover PowerPoint. You could deliver that in maybe setting up a camera in front of your CEO and letting that person do a prepared speech. Or you could sit down for a fireside chat with a skilled interviewer, knowing where you're going, knowing the points you need to hit, and staying away from any things you don't want to hit. Which is going to be more engaging? Which are people going to remember after it's done and refer back to? Is it the voiceover PowerPoint that they actually were working on deleting email while it was going on? Or is it the interview, the chat that humanizes things? And one of the things that I know from the research on my book is that when people feel connected to their leaders, they'll walk through fire. They'll withstand all kinds of overwhelm and uncertainty if they feel connected to the mission of the organization, each other, and their leaders. So having that conversation is so important.
And one of the ways to make that connection is to have that transparency. And while it is possible for that leader just to sit down with a camera, with or without a PowerPoint, and talk, there's something about vulnerability and transparency that when you have the right interviewer who can say, how does that make you feel? I always go back to Larry King. And, a lot of the younger people will be like, well, who is Larry King? I think the interesting thing is that he never let guests get away with anything. They couldn't just skirt past an important topic and move on to something else. But at the same time, if there was that little crack of vulnerability where he could get that person to share their soul, the person would do it. And therefore, the people watching would be more connected, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. People are drawn to that when you can open it up. And it's really hard, I think, by yourself in front of a camera to be the same way as it is when you have somebody who's saying, like Dr. Phil, how does that make you feel? I think when you can have someone actually get people to open up, that's really good. And I know in your book, you interviewed one person who talked about this transparency. He would have interviews with his employees live and let him ask anything, right?
Right. He has lunch with the president, and you're talking about Bill from Ford Financial, and he has this policy that his employees can ask anything they want, which is concerning to the rest of his staff. But it is that transparency that builds loyalty, because even when there is tough news, if you know that your employer is telling you the truth, is doing it with the compassion and the thought that is necessary, and even if you don't necessarily like the decision, it still makes you feel valued and seen. And that's when people just dig in and do what's necessary.
So when companies do what we're talking about and actually have a real fireside chat with a real interview, not just preset questions, move on to the next thing. One of the things that we've done that I think was really smart is we came up with this idea of a production call. It's not a sound. It's not a sound check. It's a production call. My assumption is I've never been on the Today Show, but by the way, if the Today Show is listening, I would love to come on. We'll just put it out there in the universe.
Or Kelly and Ryan.
Or Kelly, actually, Kelly and Ryan. We are the Kelly and Ryan of webinars, and so they should have us on to talk about that. But if we were to go on one of those shows, the reality is they wouldn't just say, here's Tom and Eliz, and we've never seen them before. There would have been a sit down, if not with the celebrity interviewer, certainly with their producers.
With the production team.
With the production team, where we would go through, and as you said, knowing where we want to go and where we don't want to go in the interview is super important. important. And early on when we started the webinar talk show, we were hired by the National Speakers Association, of which we're both members, to oversee, if you will, 25 presentations that were supposed to be the concurrent breakouts at their conference. And when they had to cancel the conference and go to a virtual format, they kept their main stage stuff for those 3 days in August, but they had 25 speakers prepared to 3 months later deliver really great content. And they had to move it into a virtual way, but trust me, nobody wants 25 hours in a single 3-day period of a conference. So they came up with a unique idea, and that was every Monday and Thursday for 3 months, 25 of these, they did these webinars. But instead of just letting people go do their talking head thing, they created this talk show format, and we hosted it. And every single speaker was required to sit down for 30 minutes with us in advance of that to talk about the production needs of the show. And it's interesting when you're having professional speakers on, how many people said, well, I don't need to do a sound check. I'm a professional speaker. And kudos to the National Speakers Association. Their answer was, that's so weird. Everyone's a professional speaker. And this isn't a sound check. This is a production call to make sure you understand what you're walking into with Tom and Eliz, and they know what you want to accomplish. Because we learned, a lot from asking people, what are the 3 points you want to get across? Sometimes in their presentation, because of Q&A or other things, they would leave out one of their own points. And we were able to come back and work it in a way that seemed like seamless, right?
Absolutely. And I do think it is one of the most important experiences in my career was being on the other side of the sound check, of the production call, and reminding myself that there are things that we do in any business that seem like little check the box things. But if we sort of remove ourselves from our arrogance about, but I am a professional, I have done this for 100 years and I know exactly how to do it, and actually look at how what we're being asked to do serves the client, serves the other people, serves your team or whatever, saying yes and actually being professional and present in those things are so important. But yeah, you're right. And we came up with 7 different formats of having that hour-long program that didn't have to be droning on voice over PowerPoint. Not that there's anything wrong with PowerPoint if it's used very, very well.
Right. But we did. We had sort of the longer format speech with the shorter Q&A. We had the shorter speech with the longer Q&A. We had the entire fireside chat for the hour where us and the audience were managing Q&A the whole time. We had ones where they, would show a video and then we would dissect what we just watched. There were so many different ways to fill that hour that the people who did watch all 25 of them felt like it wasn't the same thing twice a week for 3 months. So I learned a lot from doing that. And then I had another client who they had an industry expert, but the person wasn't a speaker. But the content that the person had was very necessary to their manufacturing companies who were furloughing people and everything else. And they wanted to get the information from this consultant to their people. They had me come in and interview the person. And afterwards, that person said, I'm normally so nervous about having to give a speech and I've never done it virtually. But sitting down, they didn't feel alone, was what he said. He goes, I felt like I had someone there that I wasn't going to stumble. And I'm like, that's one of the reasons that you have someone like us do these interviews.
Well, right. And somebody who is an expert in some sort of manufacturing topic, public speaking is probably not in the description of what they need to be good at. It's typically, and a lot of technical people are great with their information, but aren't comfortable speaking in front of people, which is fine if you have somebody to guide that experience for them. And it does create that comfort level of like, oh, I just need to come and know the stuff I already know and be the person I already am. Cool. That's a lot easier than trying to put myself in the speaker role.
So I've got a couple of more questions for you and a couple more things we should share with everybody. But first, I've got to thank the other sponsor of this episode, So this episode, like all of them, is brought to you by Podfly Productions. Podfly, they take the time and the headache out of creating your own podcast. They set you up with the right equipment, training, and guidance to ensure that you sound amazing. Podfly does all the heavy lifting and that pesky technical work so that you can focus on creating great content, growing your audience, and having really insightful conversations with cool people like Eliz Green. Hey, if you want to start a podcast, and I know some of you do, and for that, podcasts are interview format, man, so get with it. If you want to start a podcast, jump over to podfly.net/coolthings and check out the offer that they have for the listeners of this show. So, Eliz, I used to call the show Cool Things Entrepreneurs Do. What are some cool things you've seen clients do with this interview format?
That's an excellent question. I think the most exciting thing about this format is letting the people fly and having that interaction in real time with the people who are watching the interview. That there can be, and that happens in a hybrid event or a purely virtual event. Being able to look and see a comment or a question that comes in right in the moment that adds to the conversation. I right now have little goosebumps because it is so exciting when that happens. There's a different kind of energy in the conversation when there's multiple people in the conversation. There's the 2 or 3 people that are on camera, but there could be hundreds of people in the chat and in the Q&A, which you couldn't have if you were all in person because it is considered rude to shout a comment from the audience. But when it happens in a virtual or hybrid, it is very easy for that host to fold it into the conversation and just add so much richness to what happens.
You bring up a really interesting point because having a master of ceremonies and an interviewer also allows that chat room and any Q&A that people actually have to organically be added in. Whereas if somebody has a prepared speech, whether they have PowerPoint or not, to properly give a prepared speech in a video environment, you need to be looking at the camera. There are very few speakers. Now, I've seen a couple, but there are very few who can actually give their prepared speech and read the chat room out of that little corner of their eye simultaneously. Most people, if they need to stop and look at Q&A, there's like this pause in their speech. And if they're on video camera, they're looking down. And if they're like me and they're in their 50s, they have to squint really hard to read the small print that's in the thing, put on glasses. And, they misinterpret the question. And now the chat room is scented up and they can't scroll because they're supposed to be speaking. Having someone like you and I there to monitor that, it really makes the event more interactive. And I mean, anybody who works in the live events world, whether they're virtual or in person, we've talked about interaction for 20 years. And, you can really do it in virtual, but you can't do it alone. Having someone to be that interviewer, to be that captain of the ship, if you will, makes that event that much better.
I also think the other thing that is really important is we have all been in chats that have gone off the rails.
Oh, yes. Or we've been in Zooms where you had like a Zoom bomber or something that's taken it not just off the rails, but, way off the rails.
Right. Or somebody in an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting or whatever who is just monopolizing. All of those things are very difficult to manage if you are the speaker. But if you have somebody whose job it is to pay attention to that interaction, that makes a big difference. The job, in addition, is to frame that interaction, to set the ground rules, to describe how this is going to work. For example, I know you and I, when we're doing an association event, for example, and this would work for a corporate event, a sales meeting. Let's say it's a sales kickoff for your team. There are interactions that when it's in person, you anticipate. You anticipate that there's going to be the lobby bar. You anticipate that there's going to be conversation that happens in the hallways. You anticipate that there's going to be a point where you're passing the microphone around to ask questions of the speaker. You need to be able to describe and frame the interaction in the virtual world the same way. Well, our hallway conversations is that chat room. That's how we communicate with each other. Q&A, if you're using that, for example, on Zoom, that's how you stand up to the microphone and get your question in front of the speaker. And how are you going to create that lobby bar? That may be the most important piece of your meeting.
And
how are you allowing them to be together?
So many virtual conferences have just let the lobby bar go. You and I attended a conference for an organization that we were part of, and there was no place to network. It was a 3-day event, and it wasn't long any one day. It was just a couple hours. And I just put in the chat, who wants to go to the lobby bar? And I put my personal Zoom link during the keynote. And like half the people, there were like 140 people on the thing, 70 people came to the Zoom room afterwards just to hang out and chat like they might go to the bar after the thing. So then the next day, people were like, you're hosting the lobby bar again. And I ended up doing it every day of the conference. But now that's something I bring to my clients. If I'm the host is, look, we can do that. And one of my clients did a great thing. They weren't using Zoom, and not every platform has perfected the breakout room situation that Zoom has done. So if you get too many people, every 70 people can't talk. You need to break them into groups of 4 or 5, be able to send them out. So what we did was they had like a 4-hour conference, and it was going to be held on a different platform. And that platform didn't have breakout rooms. So in the invitation and throughout the day as the host, I told them, imagine if we were at a hotel having this in a ballroom. At the end of the day, we would all go to the lobby, we'd get on buses, and we'd go to the Museum of Art for our networking cocktail party, right? We've all been to conferences where they transport you to some local venue that's beautiful with a view of the ocean or whatever. And I said, so we're going to do that today. At the end, you'll get a new link, or it was in your original sign up. And at 5 o'clock, we're going to go to a Zoom room, and then that becomes the networking cocktail. And, about half the people came. But it was a conference that had hundreds of people, so they still had hundreds of people at the networking. We broke them up into small rooms, brought them back, broke them up. And that was all part of the experience that I was able to bring as a master of ceremonies, and an idea that the meeting planner wouldn't have. That's another reason to work with a professional master of ceremonies, is someone like you, Eliz, or like me. We've done dozens, if not hundreds of these, which means we've seen more than maybe somebody has who's doing their first one.
Right. And really leverage the experience of people who have been doing this for a while. I know both you and I are completely happy to have a conversation with anybody about what are some things that you could do to let your people network with each other, deliver that content in a way that's going to be engaging. Even ideas about how are you going to honor the sponsors, like the way that you're honoring yours. There are ways to do that are just fluid, and it doesn't have to be like, here are our sponsors, blah, 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 blah.
Well, and you bring up another thing to ping on this interview format. I've done that with so many clients, and I know you have too, where during the breaks or at the kickoff to the breaks or coming back, we interview the sponsor. It might be a little 4-minute 2-question interview, but it highlights that sponsor in a way that's not just the sponsor going, hi, I sell widgets at 1-800-widget. It's, tell us about, how did you get into the widget business? And they tell, all of a sudden they have a human side. So this interview format doesn't just mean your speaker. It's a great way to highlight sponsors. It's a great way to highlight your staff. It's a great way to highlight attendees, because you might have people in the audience who are really smart. Sign them up to be interviewed as part of it.
Right. Well, and I think you hit on something that's really important. We are all, at this point, hungering for human connection. So if you can think about how are you going to do what you thought you were going to do in person in a way that humanizes the experience and lets the people that you value connect with each other. I don't know that there's a better way to do that than having conversation.
Yep. And I've been telling people all along, they don't have to hire me and or Eliz. There's other people out there.
It'd be nice if they did.
Oh, sure. There's other people out there who might know how to interview people. Mm-hmm. But if you're putting on a conference and you're not incorporating interviews as one of the ways you're sharing data and you're sharing information, you might be leaving one of the most engaging ways out of your event. And I'll tell you what, there's Zoom fatigue out there. There is virtual fatigue. If you can find a way to engage people better, do it. And I think the interview format is one way to do it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Well, Eliz, thanks for coming on Making Waves at Sea Level and talking with me about this. I had thought about just doing one of those episodes where it's just me chatting, but I thought that was sort of awkward to talk about the interview format and not have a guest.
Right, exactly.
So, and thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened. I say it every show, if it wasn't for the audience, why would we do the podcast? So make sure that you're tuning in every Tuesday and Thursday to Making Waves at Sea Level. And as long as you're a big podcast fan, go check out the Webinar Talk Show. Eliz, where can they find it?
They can find us at webinartalkshow.com, or if they wanted to watch us live on Mondays and Wednesday at 11 o'clock Central Time in the morning, webinartalkshow.live is how you find us there.
And there's a Facebook page where all of the raw interviews live, and then we edit them and they're on your YouTube channel also. So lots of ways to find Webinar Talk Show. There's this thing called Google. If you Google it, you will probably find it in one of those places.
Indeed, you will.
Awesome. Well, again, Eliz, thanks for being here. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. We'll be back in a couple of days with some more interviews because I think the interview format is awesome. But in the meantime, go out there. Make some waves. Make sure your career ladder is against the right wall. And while you're out there doing stuff, have fun. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Making Waves at Sea Level podcast. Without your listening to these in-depth conversations, there would be no show. Connect with Tom at tomsinger.com and follow him on Twitter and Instagram at tomsinger.